At Colonel James Ford's grand military funeral, Clarence Moore, a humble cemetery gatekeeper, stands quietly with a 1968 penny to honor his old comrade. Mocked by businessmen as a mere janitor, Clarence faces humiliation but remains dignified. A young soldier, Private Rodriguez, discovers Clarence's veteran ID, revealing his heroic past as a Marine who saved lives in Fallujah. As the ceremony begins, SEAL Commander Lockheart halts it, saluting Clarence for saving his father's life. The crowd is stunned. Who is this unassuming man, and what secrets does his quiet service hide? The truth unfolds, reshaping perceptions. Thank you for joining us in honoring Clarence Moore's story of quiet valor. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more untold tales of heroes among us. Your support keeps these stories alive, reminding us to respect the unseen. Like, share, and comment to spread the message of true honor. Clarence Moore, a weathered man of 78, stood silently before the flag-draped coffin, his stooped frame a quiet sentinel in the solemn air of the military cemetery. His lined face, etched with decades of memories, held a stillness that seemed to anchor the moment. The suit-clad man's mocking words cut through the hush. "Excuse me, sir. This is a private military funeral. Staff should use the service entrance." Snickers rippled among the gathered mourners, their eyes darting away, unwilling to meet the old gatekeeper's gaze. Clarence didn't flinch. His heart, heavy with the weight of years and unspoken stories, remained steady, his eyes fixed on the coffin as if it held a piece of his own soul. But then the unexpected happened. The SEAL commander, a man of iron resolve and decorated valor, stepped out of the rigid formation. His boots crunched softly on the grass as he stopped before Clarence, his hand rising in a slow, deliberate salute. The cemetery fell into a profound silence, the kind that presses against the chest as every head turned. Who was this gatekeeper, this unassuming figure in a worn janitor's uniform, to command such respect from an elite warrior? What bond, forged in the fires of the past, could halt a military funeral in its tracks? For over 2 decades, Clarence Moore had been the quiet guardian of the military cemetery, tending to its grounds with a devotion that bordered on sacred. His life was simple, contained within the 4 walls of a modest room beside the cemetery gate. The space was sparse, a narrow bed with sheets tucked in crisp military corners, a small table where he took his meals of bread and soup, a well-worn Bible that had traveled with him through 3 combat deployments, and a single black and white photograph that hung like a shrine on the wall. In it, a young Clarence, proud in his Marine dress blues, stood shoulder to shoulder with Colonel James Ford, their faces alight with the camaraderie of youth and shared survival. Fallujah had been their crucible, a place where bullets sang and death was a constant companion. It was there, in the chaos of an ambush, that Ford had dragged a wounded Clarence to safety, his hands slick with blood, his voice a steady anchor against the terror. That moment bound them, not just as comrades, but as brothers whose lives were forever intertwined. Clarence had never sought recognition for his service. After leaving the Marines, he shunned the spotlight, declining veteran benefits or invitations to join organizations where old soldiers swapped stories over coffee. Instead, he chose the cemetery, a place where he could walk among the headstones of his fallen brothers, ensuring their resting places were honored. Each morning at precisely 0600, he raised the American flag at the cemetery's entrance, his hands steady as he unfolded the stars and stripes, ensuring not a single crease marred its display. At dusk, he folded it with the same precision, a ritual that grounded him, a quiet vow to those who rested beneath the earth. His days were governed by this military discipline, a rhythm that gave structure to a life that might otherwise have drifted into loneliness. To the other cemetery workers, Clarence was a reliable fixture, a man of few words who swept the paths and trimmed the grass with meticulous care. They didn't know the source of his precision, the years of drills, the muscle memory of a Marine who had once stood at attention under fire. Nor did they understand the quiet empathy he extended to grieving families, born from his own losses, from the brothers he'd buried in the weight of survival. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband lay in Section C, always found a moment to chat with Clarence about the weather, her voice lighter in his presence, as if his quiet strength absorbed some of her sorrow. The Johnson family, whose son had been lost in Afghanistan, noticed how Clarence kept their boy's grave pristine, free of leaves and debris, without ever being asked. These small acts were his way of honoring the living as much as the dead, a bridge between their pain and his own. But it was his bond with Colonel James Ford that defined him. Though Ford was still alive, serving in various roles across the region, their friendship endured through occasional phone calls and holiday cards, a quiet understanding between men who had stared down death together. Ford had tried, over the years, to pull Clarence into a wider world, offering to help him access veteran benefits, to connect him with old Marines from their unit. But Clarence always declined, his voice soft but firm. "I'm where I need to be, sir," he'd say, taking care of the ones who can't take care of themselves anymore. For Clarence, the cemetery was not just a job, but a calling, a place where he could stand watch over his brothers, ensuring their sacrifices were never forgotten. Each morning as he made his rounds, Clarence carried out a ritual of his own making. He sought out graves that hadn't seen flowers in too long, or those whose families lived too far to visit. On each, he placed a single penny, not for superstition or ceremony, but as a marker of remembrance. "So they know someone still remembers," he'd told Marcus, a young cemetery worker who had grown curious about the habit. Marcus, moved by the simplicity of the gesture, began leaving coins of his own, sensing that this was more than a quirk. It was an extension of the brotherhood Clarence had known in life, carried into death. The act was a quiet rebellion against oblivion, a way to say that no soldier, no matter how long gone, was ever truly alone. Tucked inside a book in Clarence's room was a letter, its edges worn from years of careful handling. Written in Colonel Ford's steady hand, it read, "If I go before you do, I want you standing beside me like the old days. No need to say anything. Just stand." Those words were a covenant, a promise that Clarence honored every day, not just for Ford, but for every soul in the cemetery. When the SEAL commander saluted him that day, it wasn't just a gesture of respect. It was a recognition of Clarence's unspoken vow, a life spent standing watch, ensuring that no one was forgotten. Clarence Moore stood at the edge of the sprawling Arlington West Cemetery, his weathered hands clasped tightly around a single 1968 penny, its copper surface dulled by time but heavy with meaning. The coin was a relic from his deployment year, a tangible piece of the past he shared with Colonel James Ford, a man whose presence had anchored him through the chaos of war and the quiet struggles of life after. The black suit he wore, threadbare at the cuffs and slightly too large for his frame, was the same one he'd donned for every funeral and church service over the past 15 years. It smelled faintly of mothballs and carried the weight of every solemn occasion he'd attended. Today, though, it felt heavier, as if the fabric itself understood the gravity of his purpose. He wasn't here as a former Marine, not as a subordinate who'd once saluted Ford with crisp precision, but as a brother, bound by a promise forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice. Years ago, in a dimly lit office cluttered with mass and memories, Colonel Ford had handed Clarence a letter. The older man's voice had been gravelly, worn by years of command and recent battles with his failing health. His eyes, though, still burned with the intensity of a leader who'd seen too much, but refused to look away. "Clarence," we had said, leaning forward, his hands steady despite the tremble of age, "when my time comes, I don't want a parade of strangers gawking at my coffin. I want the people who understand what it means to serve, to live for something bigger than yourself. I want you there, not as my Marine, but as my family." Those words had seared themselves into Clarence's heart, a beacon he returned to whenever life's weight threatened to pull him under. He'd kept the letter in a small wooden box at home, unfolding it carefully on quiet nights, tracing the inked words as if they could summon Ford's voice back from the past. Each reading reminded him that some bonds, forged in the fire of war, were unbreakable, eternal. Now, standing on the cemetery's manicured grass, Clarence felt the ache of that bond more acutely than ever. The air was thick with the scent of freshly turned earth and the faint hum of anticipation as mourners gathered for Ford's funeral. It was the grandest military ceremony the cemetery had hosted in months, a fitting tribute to a man whose name carried weight in both military and civilian circles. Colonel James Ford had been a Titan, decorated for valor in multiple conflicts, a leader who'd commanded respect on battlefields and in boardrooms long after he'd hung up his uniform. The guest list was a who's who of power and prestige: active duty officers in pristine dress blues, retired generals with chests heavy with medals, government officials in tailored suits, and local dignitaries who'd known Ford through civic ties. The ceremony promised full military honors: a flag-draped coffin, an honor guard standing sentinel, the sharp crack of a rifle salute, and the mournful wail of taps echoing across the graves. Clarence had learned of the funeral through the whispered channels of the old Marine network, a web of loyalty that still connected men like him to the past. He hadn't hesitated. The promise he'd made to Ford all those years ago wasn't just words, it was a debt. Ford had saved his life once, not with a grand gesture, but with the quiet, steady leadership that had pulled Clarence through a mission gone sideways, when bullets sang and hope was a fleeting thing. Now, standing apart from the polished crowd, Clarence felt the weight of that debt in his chest, a mix of gratitude and grief that made it hard to breathe. He didn't belong among the dignitaries, and he knew it. His suit, his unassuming posture, his weathered face, they marked him as an outsider in this sea of power. But he didn't need their approval. He was here for Ford, to place that penny on his coffin, a silent farewell from one brother to another. As the crowd swelled, Clarence stayed at the periphery, his eyes fixed on the flag-draped coffin in the distance. It gleamed under the morning sun, a stark reminder of the man who'd once filled a room with his presence. The sight stirred a pang of loss so sharp it felt like a blade. He could still hear Ford's laugh, that deep, rumbling sound that had steadied him in moments of doubt. He could still see the way Ford's jaw tightened when he spoke of duty, of the cost of service. Clarence's fingers tightened around the penny, its edges pressing into his palm. This was his goodbye, small but sincere, a gesture that carried the weight of their shared history. But not everyone saw it that way. A group of men in crisp suits, their voices slick with self-importance, stood nearby, casting glances his way. Richard Grayson, a city councilman who had crossed paths with Ford at charity galas, was the first to speak. His tone was low, meant to seem discreet, but it carried with the calculated cruelty of someone who knew they had an audience. "Would you look at that?" he murmured, nudging his companion. "Even the cemetery janitor's here, trying to bask in the colonel's spotlight." Mark Stevens, a real estate developer with a smirk that matched his polished shoes, chuckled. "Probably thinks this is his big break, networking with the military elite." David Chen, a banker who'd sat on boards with Ford, didn't bother hiding his disdain. "Someone should tell him this isn't a job fair." Their words hit Clarence like a cold wind, sharp and biting. But he didn't flinch. He bowed his head, his lips pressed into a thin line, and focused on the coffin. He'd heard worse in his life: taunts in boot camp, slurs in the field, the casual dismissals of men who'd never known the weight of a rifle or the cost of a promise. But here, at Ford's funeral, the cruelty stung deeper. It wasn't just about him. It was about the bond he'd come to honor, the sacred space they were tarnishing with their careless words. Still, he stood still, his silence a shield, his dignity unyielding. Then came Jennifer Walsh, the funeral coordinator, her heels clicking softly on the path as she approached. Her face was professional, her smile polite but cold, like a winter sun that offered no warmth. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clipped. "Are you on the guest list for today's service?" Clarence met her gaze, his eyes steady but soft. "No, ma'am," he replied quietly. "I just came to pay my respects." Her expression didn't change, but her tone grew firmer. "I'm sorry, but this is a private ceremony. If you're not on the list, I'll have to ask you to step outside the main area." Clarence nodded, his heart sinking but his resolve unbroken. He turned to move, his steps slow and deliberate, the penny still clutched in his hand. As he spun back, his foot caught on a patch of uneven grass, and the penny slipped from his fingers, tumbling to the ground with a faint clink. Laughter erupted from the group of businessmen, sharp and mocking. "Oh, look at that," Stevens called out, his voice dripping with malice. "Saving up that janitor's salary, are we?" No one moved to help. The crowd around him seemed to blur, their faces a mix of indifference and amusement. Clarence knelt, his knees creaking, and retrieved the coin, his fingers trembling not from shame, but from the effort to hold back the tide of emotions. grief for Ford, anger at their cruelty, and a quiet, stubborn pride that refused to let them break him. The moment caught the eye of a young soldier standing near a military vehicle, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid. His face softened for a moment, a flicker of recognition, perhaps of the quiet dignity in Clarence's solitude. But Clarence didn't see it. He straightened, the penny back in his pocket, and walked away, his heart heavy with the goodbye he'd never get to say. The ceremony continued without him. The rifles fired, taps played, the flag was folded with precision. But Clarence's absence left a void no one else could feel. He'd come to honor a brother, to lay a piece of their shared past to rest. But the world had reminded him, as it so often did, that not all debts are seen, not all promises are understood. The morning air was crisp, heavy with the scent of dew-soaked grass, as Clarence Moore made his way across the lawn toward the public viewing area. The invitation had been clear. The ceremony was for invited guests only, and though his heart ached to stand closer to honor a fallen comrade, he nodded with quiet respect at the usher's words. At 78, Clarence carried himself with a dignity honed by decades of hardship and service, his steps deliberate despite the worn soles of his shoes. Each movement spoke of a man who had learned to accept life's slights without bitterness, though the weight of them lingered in his slightly hunched shoulders. As he walked, the grass, slick from the morning's moisture, betrayed him. His foot slipped and he stumbled, catching himself just before falling. A single penny, his only coin, a small token he kept for reasons he never spoke aloud, slipped from his pocket and rolled across the ground, glinting faintly in the sunlight before coming to rest near a group of well-dressed men. Richard Grayson, a businessman whose tailored suit and easy confidence marked him as someone accustomed to commanding attention, noticed the penny first. His lips curled into a smirk as he leaned toward his companions, his voice carrying deliberately loud across the quiet lawn. "Well, look at that," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Someone's life savings just hit the pavement." The men around him erupted into laughter, their chuckles sharp and careless, slicing through the solemnity of the moment. A few nearby attendees turned to look, their expressions flickering with discomfort at the cruelty of the jest. But none stepped forward. The weight of social propriety, or perhaps cowardice, kept them silent, their gazes quickly darting away as if the scene were a stain they didn't wish to acknowledge. Clarence's face flushed with a quiet humiliation, though he refused to let it show beyond the tightening of his jaw. Slowly he lowered himself to the ground, his knees creaking in protest, the arthritis that had plagued him for years making the simple act of kneeling a small battle of its own. His gnarled fingers reached for the penny, not because of its value, but because it was his, a small piece of his pride, now tarnished by the laughter still ringing in his ears. As he bent forward, his veteran ID card slipped from his shirt pocket, landing softly on the grass. In his haste to escape the spotlight of ridicule and retreat to the safety of the public area, he didn't notice. He rose, clutching the penny tightly, and continued his walk, his head held high despite the sting of shame that burned in his chest. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter further. From his post near the military vehicles, Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez watched the scene unfold. At 19, Tommy was young, his face still soft with the earnestness of someone who believed in the values he'd been taught: honor, respect, duty. His role in the honor guard detail for Colonel Ford's funeral was a point of pride, but what he saw now stirred a deep unease in his gut. The sight of an elderly man, clearly a veteran by his bearing, mocked for a moment of clumsiness and dismissed to the fringes of a ceremony he deserved to attend, clashed violently with the principles Tommy held dear. His hands tightened around his rifle, not out of anger but from a restless need to act, to do something. When Clarence moved away, Tommy's eyes fell on the small card left behind in the grass. He stepped forward, his polished boots sinking slightly into the grass, and picked it up, his fingers tracing the faded text. Clarence Moore Carter, U.S. Marine Corps, 1969 to 1971, combat veteran. The words hit Tommy like a quiet thunderclap. His chest tightened as he glanced up, watching Clarence's solitary figure moving toward the public area, his steps slow but steady, his shoulders carrying a quiet dignity that refused to bow to cruelty. Tommy's mind raced, replaying the laughter, the businessmen's smug faces, and the indifference of the crowd. This man had fought for people like them, for all of them, and yet they'd humiliated him without a second thought. Something fierce and resolute sparked in Tommy's eyes. He couldn't stand by and let this pass. Clutching the ID card, he turned and sought out his squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, who was overseeing the honor guard's formation nearby. "Sarge," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. "That man they just sent away? He's a Marine veteran, combat vet from the Vietnam era." He held out the ID card, a ticket, his hand steady as he presented it to Martinez. The sergeant, a seasoned soldier with a no-nonsense demeanor, took the card and studied it, his brow furrowing as he read the faded text. His gaze shifted to Clarence, now nearly at the edge of the public viewing area, then back to the group of businessmen who were still chuckling among themselves, oblivious to the gravity of what they'd done. Martinez's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger passing through his eyes. He handed the card back to Tommy and said, "Rodriguez, go find Commander Lockheart. Tell him we have a situation that requires his immediate attention." Tommy nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination as he set off to find the commander. Meanwhile, at the front of the gathered crowd, Commander James Lockheart stood among the Navy SEAL contingent, his presence commanding respect even in stillness. At 45, Lockheart was a decorated officer, his chest adorned with ribbons that told stories of courage and sacrifice across multiple deployments. His face, weathered by years of service, carried the quiet intensity of a man who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. Today, he was here to honor Colonel Ford, a man under whose command his father, Marine Staff Sergeant Michael Lockheart, had served in Fallujah in 2004. The funeral was a solemn duty, but Lockhart's mind was heavy with memories of his father's stories. Tales of brotherhood, of men who risked everything for one another in the chaos of war. When Private Rodriguez approached, breathless but composed, and handed him Clarence's ID card, Lockhart's world seemed to pause. He read the name, Clarence Moore, and a jolt of recognition shot through him. His father had spoken of a man named Clarence, a Marine who had saved his life during a brutal firefight in Fallujah. The details were etched into Lockhart's memory: the ambush, the smoke, the deafening gunfire, and the quiet courage of a man who had dragged his father to safety, refusing to leave him behind. Lockhart's fingers tightened around the card, his heart pounding as he looked toward the public area where Clarence now stood, alone at the edge of the crowd. The sight of the elderly man, dismissed and mocked, ignited a fire in Lockhart's chest, a mix of gratitude, fury, and a fierce need to set things right. As the flag ceremony began, the crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Clarence, still unaware of the ID card he'd lost, bent down at the edge of the public area to retrieve his penny, which had slipped from his hand again. The small act, so full of quiet determination, caught Lockhart's eye. Without hesitation, the commander raised his hand, signaling for the ceremony to halt. The honor guard froze, the flag still raised, and every eye turned toward Lockhart as he stepped forward, his boots striking the ground with purpose. The crowd parted as he made his way to Clarence, his heart swelling with a mix of awe and resolve of awe. "Are you the man who once fought alongside Colonel Ford at Fallujah?" Lockhart asked, his voice steady but laced with reverence. Clarence, startled, looked up, his weathered face etched with confusion. He nodded slightly, unsure of where this was leading. In that moment, Lockhart snapped to attention, his hand rising in a crisp salute, the gesture carrying the weight of decades of gratitude. 6 other SEALs, sensing the gravity of the moment, followed suit, their salutes a silent chorus of respect. The crowd gasped, the air charged with a sudden, profound stillness. Richard Grayson and his companions fell silent, their earlier laughter now a bitter memory they couldn't escape. Lockhart's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "This man once saved my father's life. He's not just a bystander, he's a hero." The words landed like a thunderbolt, reverberating through the crowd. High-ranking officers stepped forward, their faces solemn, as they invited Clarence to join the honor formation at the heart of the ceremony. Clarence hesitated, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, the weight of years of quiet sacrifice suddenly lifted by this unexpected recognition. As he stepped forward, the crowd parted, their murmurs of respect following him like a gentle tide. Richard Grayson stood frozen, his head bowed, unable to meet Clarence's gaze. A few attendees approached Clarence quietly, offering soft apologies, their voices thick with regret for their earlier silence. Tommy Rodriguez watched from his post, his chest swelling with pride, knowing his small act had sparked this moment of justice. Sergeant Martinez gave him a nod, a rare gesture of approval that said more than words ever could. And Commander Lockheart, standing beside Clarence in the honor formation, felt a deep peace settle over him, knowing he had honored not just a hero, but the man who had given him the chance to have a father. The ceremony resumed, the flag lowered with reverence, but the moment that had just unfolded lingered in every heart. Clarence stood tall, his penny clutched tightly in his hand, his veteran's pride restored, not by the coin, but by the respect of those who had finally seen him for who he truly was. The cemetery stretched out in solemn rows of white headstones, each one a silent testament to sacrifice. Clarence stood alone near the public viewing area, his weathered hands fumbling to retrieve a coin that had slipped from his grasp. The faint clink of metal on stone was drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd gathered for the funeral of Colonel Ford. Clarence's simple black suit, slightly frayed at the cuffs, marked him as an outsider in the eyes of many attendees. Businessmen in tailored coats, in mourners and polished shoes, who cast sidelong glances his way. To them, he was just the janitor, the gatekeeper, invisible in his humility. But in his chest, beneath the worn fabric, beat the heart of a Marine, one who had carried the weight of war and never sought the spotlight for it. Across the field, Commander Lockhart's sharp eyes caught sight of Clarence's solitary figure. His dress blue uniform gleamed under the overcast sky, the medals pinned to his chest reflecting a career of service. As he watched Clarence, a memory stirred deep within him, not of the elderly man before him, but of a younger Marine, fearless under fire, whose name his father had spoken with reverence until his dying day. Lockhart's jaw tightened, a swell of gratitude and resolve rising in his chest. This was no mere caretaker. This was a man who had earned his place among the honored, not through titles or wealth, but through blood and brotherhood. "Sergeant Martinez," Lockhart said, turning to Rodriguez, his squad leader, his voice low but firm. "Halt the ceremony. I need 2 minutes." The order was unexpected, rippling through the ranks like a stone dropped in still water. Rodriguez blinked, but Lockhart's reputation as a SEAL commander carried an authority that silenced questions. The honor guard lowered their rifles, the bugler paused mid-breath, and the chaplain's murmured prayers fell silent. Mourners shifted, sensing a shift in the air, their curiosity tinged with confusion. Lockhart didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his polished shoes cutting a deliberate path through the sea of mourners. Each step was measured, purposeful, as if he were marching not across a cemetery, but into battle. The crowd parted instinctively, their whispers fading as they watched the commander move toward the lone figure by the fence. Clarence, still crouched over his dropped coin, didn't notice the approaching figure at first. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of memories that always surfaced at funerals like this. Colonel Ford's face flashed in his mind, the camaraderie of their shared tours in Iraq, the chaos of that day when an IED tore through their convoy. He had acted on instinct then, dragging men to safety through smoke and gunfire, never thinking of himself as a hero. To Clarence, it was just what Marines did. Now, decades later, he stood on the sidelines, content to honor his brother-in-arms from a distance, unnoticed by the crowd. But the sound of a voice, warm yet commanding, broke through his thoughts. "Sergeant Moore, I presume." Clarence looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. The rank, spoken with such respect, felt like a distant echo from another life. Before him stood Lockhart, his uniform a stark contrast to Clarence's simple attire, yet his gaze held no judgment, only recognition. Clarence's breath caught as he straightened, his mind racing to place the man addressing him. "Sir," he began, his voice rough but steady. "My father was Staff Sergeant Michael Lockhart. He served under Colonel Ford in your unit. He told me about a Marine named Moore who had pulled him out of a burning Humvee after an attack." The words hit Clarence like a wave, pulling him back to that blistering day in the desert. He remembered the heat, the screams, the weight of his limp body as he dragged him across 300 meters of open ground, bullets kicking up dust around them. He hadn't thought of it as bravery, just duty. But now, standing before the son of the man he'd saved, Clarence felt a rush of emotion he couldn't name. Pride, perhaps, mingled with the quiet pain of being forgotten. "Little Mickey Lockhart," Clarence murmured, a faint smile breaking through his weathered features. "Your father?" "Yes," Lockhart replied, his voice carrying a warmth that softened the formality. "Sir, according to his account, you dragged him to safety while taking enemy fire. He said you saved his life so he could come back home and have a family." The conversation, though quiet by the morning crowd, was loud enough for the nearby mourners to overhear. A group of businessmen who had earlier smirked at Clarence's stooped figure now shifted uncomfortably, their mocking whispers dying in their throats. They had misjudged him, and the realization stung. Lockhart's presence, though quiet and deliberate choice to single out this unassuming man, forced them to confront their shallow assumptions. "Sir," Clarence said softly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, "your father was a good Marine. He didn't need much saving." "Sergeant Moore, with respect, my father disagreed," Lockhart countered, his tone firm but kind. "He talked about that day for the rest of his life. He said you were the bravest man he had ever served with." Lockhart stepped back, his movements precise yet filled with reverence, as he came to perfect attention. His salute was crisp, held with a reverence that spoke louder than any speech could. The 6 SEALs who had accompanied him to their funeral, standing a few feet away, paces behind, recognized the gravity of their moment. Without hesitation, they mirrored their commander's gesture, their salutes as sharp and unwavering as his own. 7 perfect tributes directed to an elderly man who, to most, had been invisible moments earlier. The crowd fell silent, the weight of the gesture settling over them like a sacred hush. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned toward them, eyes widened, as mourners realized they were witnessing something profound and meaningful. The casual disrespect that had once tinged some attendees' attitudes toward Clarence had vanished, replaced by a dawning respect and admiration. They saw him now, not as a mere caretaker, but as a warrior, a true hero whose quiet service had outlasted the wars he'd fought in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lockhart announced, his voice booming across the cemetery with the clarity of a bugle's call, "I want you to meet Sergeant Clarence Moore, a United States Marine Corps veteran. This man served 3 tours in Iraq, earned a Bronze Star with V device for his valor, and saved the lives of at least 7 Marines during his deployments in combat." He paused, letting the words sink deep into the crowd's consciousness, ensuring every ear was fully tuned to his message. Sergeant Moore also happens to work tirelessly as a caretaker at this very cemetery, where he has spent many of the last 20 years ensuring our fallen heroes are treated with the dignity and respect they so rightly deserve. He is not simply an employee here today. He is here as Colonel Ford's steadfast brother-in-arms. The silence that followed was different now, profoundly different. From the earlier unease that hung in the air, Clarence had been mocked. This was the quiet awe of a man who had long been overlooked, now finally honored for his sacrifices. Clarence stood taller, though his shoulders trembled slightly under the weight of this newfound recognition. He had never sought fame or recognition, but in this fleeting moment, it found him, wrapping around him like a warm, long-overdue embrace from a grateful nation. Colonel Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking officer in attendance, stepped forward from the military formation with purpose. Her eyes, usually steely and composed in command, softened as they met Clarence's gaze. "Sergeant Moore," she said, her voice steady yet warm with sincerity, "would you please join us in the honor formation? Your rightful place is among your fellow Marines." The funeral coordinator, who had earlier brusquely asked Clarence to move away to the public area, now approached with a flushed face, his embarrassment almost tangible. "Mr. Moore," he stammered, his voice thick with regret, "I sincerely apologize for my mistake. I had no idea who you were. Please allow me to escort you to the honor formation." Clarence nodded slowly, his expression a blend of humility and quiet pride. As he walked toward the honor formation, flanked by the coordinator and closely followed by Lockhart's team of SEALs, the crowd watched in reverent silence. For the first time that day, Clarence felt truly seen, not as a janitor or a gatekeeper, but as the Marine he had always been, a warrior standing shoulder to shoulder with those he had served alongside so many years ago. The atmosphere at Colonel Ford's funeral had shifted dramatically, charged with a newfound reverence that seemed to ripple through the crowd. Richard Grayson, the city councilman who had earlier sneered at Clarence Moore with biting remarks, now stood before him, his face a canvas of regret. His eyes, once sharp with mockery, now carried the weight of genuine remorse. "Sir," he began, his voice low and unsteady, "I owe you an apology. What I said earlier was inexcusable. I was wrong and I'm deeply sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Grayson's shoulders slumped slightly, as if the admission had unburdened him of a shame he hadn't fully realized until that moment. Clarence, still standing tall despite the years etched into his weathered frame, met Grayson's gaze. The sting of the councilman's earlier humiliation lingered faintly, but Clarence's heart was anchored by the same unshakable character that had earned him respect as a Marine decades ago. His eyes softened, not with weakness, but with wisdom. "Son," he said, his voice steady and warm, "we all stumble. What defines a man is what he does after he sees his mistake." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a life lived with integrity, a life that had seen war, loss, and redemption. Grayson nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and self-reflection, and stepped back into the crowd, forever changed by the encounter. Commander Lockheart, who had been watching the exchange with quiet intensity, bent down to retrieve the small, tarnished object that had sparked the earlier tension. A 1968 penny, its copper surface worn but gleaming with history. To Clarence, it was more than a coin. It was a relic of his service, a tangible link to the brotherhood he shared with Colonel Ford. Lockhart held it out with reverence, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Sergeant Moore, this belongs to you, and I believe Colonel Ford would be honored to receive it." The gesture was simple, but it carried a profound respect, a recognition of Clarence's unwavering loyalty. As he handed the penny back, Lockhart's eyes gleamed with admiration for the man who stood before him, a man whose quiet dignity had reshaped the day. The crowd, once scattered and distracted, now gathered around Clarence, their attention fixed on the veteran who had been so unjustly overlooked. The funeral, which had begun as a solemn farewell to a respected officer, had transformed into something far greater, a testament to the unbreakable bonds forged in service, bonds that endured beyond rank, time, or circumstance. Clarence returned to his place beside Colonel Ford's flag-draped coffin, fulfilling the promise he had made in a letter years ago. His movements were deliberate, each step imbued with purpose. When he placed his 1968 penny on the flag, it was as if he were laying down a piece of his soul, a quiet offering of loyalty and love for his fallen comrade. One by one, the other soldiers followed, each placing their own tokens on the flag, challenge coins, unit patches, small flags, each item a symbol of their shared sacrifice. The act was unplanned, a spontaneous outpouring of respect that seemed to flow naturally from Clarence's example. The air grew thick with emotion as the crowd watched, some with tears in their eyes, others standing a little straighter, reminded of the values that bound them together. The ceremony resumed, but its tone had shifted. The rifle salute rang out with a crispness that seemed to echo through the ages. The notes of taps lingered in the air with a haunting clarity, and the folding of the flag is executed with a precision that felt almost sacred. Every gesture now carried a deeper meaning, a recognition that this moment was not just about one man's passing, but about the enduring brotherhood of those who serve. Mrs. Eleanor Ford, the colonel's widow, stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, her face etched with grief but softened by gratitude. As the tributes continued, she watched the soldiers honor her husband, their coins and patches accumulating on the flag like stars in a night sky. Her heart swelled with pride and sorrow, the weight of her loss tempered by the love that surrounded her husband's memory. After the formal ceremony concluded, she approached Clarence, her steps slow but purposeful. "Clarence," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "James spoke of you so often. He always said you were the finest Marine he ever served with. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for keeping your promise." Her words were a quiet hymn of gratitude, and as she reached out to touch his arm, Clarence felt a warmth that transcended the chill of the day. He nodded, his throat tight with emotion, and said simply, "It was my honor, ma'am." Nearby, a young officer, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, stood with a notebook in hand, her eye bright with purpose. As a military historian tasked with preserving the stories of service, she recognized the weight of what she had witnessed. Approaching Clarence, she spoke with a mix of respect and urgency. "Sergeant Moore, your service and your bond with Colonel Ford are a vital part of our military's history. Would you be willing to share your story for our oral history project?" Clarence paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the American flag waved gently in the breeze. The idea of being remembered didn't sit easily with him. He had never sought recognition. But the thought that his story might inspire others to understand the true meaning of service stirred something within him. "Ma'am," he said after a moment, "I don't need to be remembered for anything special, but if it helps folks understand what it means to serve, I'll talk to you." His words were humble, but they carried the quiet strength of a man who had lived his values every day. As the ceremony drew to a close, a young student approached Clarence, a small bouquet of flowers clutched in her hands. Her eyes were bright with admiration as she spoke. "Mr. Moore, you once taught me that everyone has value, whether they're in a uniform or work clothes. I never forgot that." Clarence's heart softened at her words, a memory of his days mentoring young people flashing through his mind. He nodded gently, his silence speaking volumes, and watched as she placed the flowers at the base of the coffin. The moment was fleeting but profound, a reminder that his influence had rippled far beyond the battlefield. The following week, a small sign appeared at the cemetery gate, its presence unheralded by fanfare or ceremony. It read simply, "Clarence Moore Section, where soldiers are never forgotten." The cemetery director, who had known Clarence for 2 decades, had insisted on the tribute, feeling it was long overdue for a man who had served both his country and his community with unwavering dedication. As Clarence walked toward the gate, the sunset cast a golden glow on the medals pinned to his chest, their faded metal gleaming with quiet pride. He paused to look at the flag one last time, its stars and stripes, a symbol of the life he had lived and the promises he had kept. Marcus, a young man with earnest eyes and calloused hands, had only been working at the cemetery for a few months when he first met Clarence Moore. The older man, with his weathered face and steady gait, had shared the quiet tradition of the challenge coin, a ritual Marcus hadn't understood at first, but grew to revere. It was more than just placing a coin on a grave. It was a silent vow, a way to honor the fallen with a gesture that carried the weight of unspoken gratitude. Marcus felt a swell of pride each time he walked the rows of headstones. But now, with Clarence's example guiding him, that pride deepened into a sense of duty. He took on extra tasks without being asked, polishing the stones in the Clarence Moore section until they gleamed under the morning sun, trimming the grass with a precision that mirrored the care Clarence had always shown. Marcus often wondered what it must have been like for Clarence, carrying the memories of war while tending to the graves of those who never came home. The thought made Marcus's chest ache, not with pity, but with a fierce resolve to uphold the standard Clarence had set. In the town beyond the cemetery gates, a transformation was stirring. Subtle at first but undeniable, the businessmen who once scoffed at Clarence, dismissing him as just a janitor in faded work clothes, now found themselves grappling with a quiet shame. They had laughed at a man whose hands had once held a rifle, whose heart had borne the weight of battles they could scarcely imagine. Among them was Harold Tate, a real estate developer with a sharp tongue and a sharper suit, who had once made a cutting remark about Clarence's pointless job. Now Harold couldn't shake the image of Clarence standing tall at Colonel Ford's funeral, his presence commanding respect in a way no title or paycheck ever could. The memory gnawed at him, forcing him to confront the arrogance he'd worn like a badge. Harold began attending veteran recognition events, his voice loud and earnest as he advocated for programs to honor those who served. He didn't speak of his past mockery, but those who knew him saw the change. A man trying to make amends, not with words, but with actions. Richard Grayson, the city councilman with a knack for polished speeches, felt a similar shift in his heart. He'd always prided himself on his community service, but Clarence's story exposed a blind spot. Richard had never considered the quiet heroes, the ones who served in civilian roles after their uniforms were packed away. Sitting in his office, staring at a framed photo of his own father in a Navy uniform, Richard felt a pang of guilt. He thought of Clarence, who had never sought a spotlight, yet had shaped the town's conscience with his steadfast humility. Richard drafted a city resolution to honor local veterans, his pen moving with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. He included a specific mention of those who served quietly, like Clarence, whose contributions were often overlooked. As he presented the resolution at the council meeting, his voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion he usually kept hidden. For Richard, it wasn't just policy, it was personal, a chance to right a wrong he hadn't even realized he'd been part of. Tommy Chen, a high school senior with a shy smile and a notebook full of history notes, carried his own connection to Clarence. Months earlier, Clarence had visited Tommy's history class, speaking with a quiet intensity about military service and the responsibilities of citizenship. Tommy had been struck by the way Clarence's eyes seemed to hold stories he didn't share, stories that lingered in the pauses between his words. Tommy's grandfather, a Vietnam veteran, had rarely spoken of his own service, and Clarence's talk felt like a bridge to understanding the man who'd raised his mother. When Tommy heard about Colonel Ford's funeral, he brought a small bouquet of wildflowers to the cemetery, his hands trembling as he placed them at the gate. He didn't know Clarence well, but he felt a debt to him, a debt for the way Clarence's words had made history feel alive, for the way they'd helped Tommy see his grandfather's silence in a new light. As he walked away, Tommy vowed to carry that lesson forward, to listen more closely to the stories hidden in plain sight. On the evening of Colonel Ford's funeral, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Clarence Moore returned to his modest quarters by the gate. The room was small, sparsely furnished, but it held a warmth that came from a life lived with purpose. On his desk sat an old photograph of himself and Colonel Ford, their young faces frozen in a moment of camaraderie from a war that felt both distant and ever-present. Clarence's fingers brushed the frame, his mind drifting to the battles they'd fought, the promises they'd made. Beside the photo, he placed a new treasure, a challenge coin from Commander Lockhart's SEAL unit, its weight heavy with meaning. Lockhart, a man of few words but piercing insight, had given it to Clarence with a nod that spoke volumes, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, a recognition that transcended rank or time. Clarence's throat tightened as he looked at the coin, its inscription glinting in the lamplight. To those who serve in silence. He didn't need applause or medals. This small token, given freely, was enough to affirm that his life's work had been seen. Clarence's story rippled far beyond the town, spreading through military networks with a speed that outpaced any official report. Veterans across the country shared the tale of the cemetery caretaker who'd once been a decorated Marine, a man Commander Lockheart had honored when others had failed to see his worth. But the heart of the story wasn't about military glory or belated recognition, though those mattered. It was about the assumptions people make, the way they judge based on what's visible. Work clothes, a humble job, without seeking the deeper truth. Clarence had spent 2 decades tending to the cemetery, treating each grave with the reverence he'd have wanted for his fallen brothers in arms. He never spoke of his own sacrifices, never leveraged his past to demand respect, never complained about the simplicity of his life. His values were etched into every small act, the way he swept the paths, the way he straightened flags, the way he paused at certain graves, his lips moving in silent prayer. The businessman who'd mocked him, Harold Tate, learned that dignity doesn't come from a corner office or a bank account. It comes from the heart. The funeral coordinator, a woman named Ellen, who'd once dismissed Clarence as unimportant, realized that respect shouldn't be rationed like a scarce resource. She thought of her own brother, a veteran struggling to find his place, and vowed to see people more clearly, to offer kindness before judgment. The community too began to shift, their eyes opened to the heroes among them, men and women in worn shoes and quiet lives, carrying stories no one had thought to ask about. Commander Lockhart's father had once told him that Clarence was brave, not just in the chaos of combat, but in the courage it took to live humbly while holding memories of extraordinary valor. Lockhart, standing at his father's grave years ago, had seen that bravery in Clarence's steady hands, his unflinching gaze. The challenge coin he left on Clarence's desk was a testament to that truth, a symbol of service that thrives in silence. In a world that often equates worth with noise, grand gestures, viral moments, Clarence Moore stood as a quiet rebuke. His valor didn't shout. It whispered, listening for the whispers of others. It wore no flashy uniform, just the faded work clothes of a man who'd made a promise on a battlefield and kept it every day since. His story, shared by those who'd witnessed it, became a reminder that honor isn't found in rank or recognition. It's found in the way we lower our heads before kindness, in the small actions that prove respect still lives. Clarence Moore, with his steady heart and silent service, showed a town, a community, and a nation what it means to truly stand for something. And in doing so, he reminded us all to look closer, to see the heroes hiding in plain sight.